And our first speaker is no stranger to the ARI, and I've known Andy for 30 years or so, since you took some of my classes when I taught at the University of Florida, and Andy is a real stalwart of ARI, and today the title of his talk is Some Thoughts on Florida's Terminal Pleistocene Flora at Early Archaeological Sites. Andy. Dr. Hemmings. You should be good to go to microphones on.
So, it turns out the plant record that goes with some of these early sites, that some are archaeological, some paleontological, but everything I'm really going to focus on is archaeological after my first slide here, or after my next slide. The record of macrobotanical stuff includes and begins in the southeast with some cypress stumps off the coast of Alabama in 60 feet of water that are 60,000 years old. They thought, after they were exposed by a hurricane in about 2010, that they were going to be 1,000 years old or something. They looked so good that they thought they were fresh. We've dated similar pieces at Sloth Hole in excess of 40 and 44,000 radiocarbon years old, and so we know within the Alcilla Basin itself, there's remarkably well preserved, fresh looking wood that's at the limits of what we can date with radiocarbon. So of course, I'm sure other speakers will harp on this as well, but Florida didn't look like Florida does today. You can see the modern outline in the center of that, and we've lost just a hair over 50% of peninsular Florida since the last glacial maximum about 22,000 years ago or so. It's going to influence my talk a little bit, but really more it's the point to stress here is as that water table rises, the salt water comes up, it pushes the freshwater aquifer higher and into a more restricted piece of unsalted land. It's affecting and rearranging the biotic communities. And I've spent a lot of my life thinking about the animals and not the plants in the intensity that I have the last few months. So hopefully I have some very novel things to say. I'm going to dance around between what is extinct, and literally it is gone, it doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet. Phyletic extinction just means that one old form has gradually through time changed into something else and we recognize it as another thing. And bison's a really classic example in mammals, that the bison antiguus horns were like this and the modern bison went to there. And they're about 2/3 the size of what they used to be. And that's kind of it. Genetically, it's a little more complicated, but we weren't really looking at the genetics of every organism 10 years ago. It's a very new thing. And like I say at the bottom here, it really does change a lot. The other important word to remember, and I'll use a lot, is extirpated. And then I'm going to fudge on this a lot because it's either locally, regionally, nationally extinct, like the horse. The horse was here everywhere, millions of years. Ask Bruce about these if you want to know. Millions of years as it evolved here in Florida, but is gone and exists elsewhere. There's lots of plants that we're going to talk about that end up being a very strange version of extirpation, or they're kind of on their way out, and how they are recognized right now is very strange. So there's roughly, depending on which source you look at, between 3,000 and 3,200 native plants in Florida. Another 1,500 or so have become naturalized that occur now in the wild in Florida, so almost 5,000 plants that we know of. I found one reference saying Leon County had 1,700 different plants alone. And unfortunately, the university biologists or botanists and paleobotanists and ecological managers, everybody has a different take on how many plants are edible. And the survivalists have taken over and have all kinds of contradictory things. If you try and look up an edible plant, you'll get more opinions than you would care to have to read. And it's always been very limited. I'm always astonished. People authoritatively published articles saying 7, 10, 20 edible plants in Florida. Well, the truth is, we know the number is in the hundreds. The critical distinction seems to be, for a lot of people, if it's delicious, it's edible. If it's bitter or sour, it's not. I don't know if there's a better thing about that or not. One issue that I've got to learn about working on this that I had not really contemplated much is dormancy rates. Typically seeds are viable, like you buy some oregano, you'll use those seeds within 2-3 years. Even if you keep them cool, you might get 5, maybe 10 years for a lot of plants. A lot of the wild things, especially the noxious weeds, have an unbelievable long dormancy rate, up to 100 years, a full century. And so what I mean by affecting C14 dates is you can have a viable seed sitting next to archaeological material. Viable meaning that seed is not the same age as the deposit, that seed could be a century old. And I think it can affect our interpretations in ways that we don't necessarily understand, and that looking at dormancy rates in the things we're dating, if we're dating seeds, which is one of the things we did do a few times here, and I'll get to those after a while. It's unfortunately a new thing that maybe sweating us a little bit, because radiocarbon dates have become so precise now that the plus or minuses on things 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years old can be 15 years. So well within the dormancy or the latent viability of a plant. So one of those things that we didn't worry about that. It's a little bit of knowledge is a little different, or a little difficult for us, because plants, of course, exist in every different environment, and they are controlled or constrained by temperature, water, soil quality, soil acidity. And I'm not going to talk about any of these things really, other than to mention them, because each one of these slides here I could talk for half an hour on each of them and we would not get through it. Chill hours is another important thing. Some have to have a certain number of hours below 47 degrees. A lot of grasses stop growing if they've been under 47 degrees or in the 30s for too long. But it's greatly affecting how much biomass is being produced at any given time throughout the course of the year. And lots of things survive in Florida all the time, or all through the year with minor interruptions to their growth. We have other, the modern plant zones I'll talk about a little bit. Elevation, of course, being an effect. And one of the things we continually stress discussing Pleistocene sites is that we lack a reasonable modern analogy. There is no saying, oh, North Florida was like North Carolina, or South Florida was kind of like the Texas coast. It doesn't really work that way in terms of the suite of animals, and certainly not in the suite of plants, and it's every bit as complicated. I'm going to skip back and forth a little bit between Vero, which is at the southeastern end of my line, and 445 kilometers to the northwest is Page Ladson, and also Ladson, another older site in Osceola that I'll talk about quite a bit. A number of years ago when we were working down at Vero, one other thing. The reason I'm going to talk about that, about Vero, and jump back and forth, is that the plants at Vero, the macrobotanical, the big pieces of things that were found, the macrobotanical samples include a lot of water plants that we would expect to find on the margins of that pond. But in the pollen data, we found a lot of the plants that are present at Page Ladson and Ladson in the big material. So there's this really strange complementary nature to them, but not in the specimens, and it gets a little more complicated, and we'll get into examples of that in a little bit. So the material excavated at Vero 105 years ago is at the Smithsonian. It turned up there. Unfortunately, they soaked everything in paraffin, so I don't know how viable for ancient DNA extraction or other, particularly radiocarbon dating. We might be able to remove it. I don't know. It's a conversation I need to have with Tom Stafford about this stuff specifically. The good news is the curators in paleobotany are very excited about people being interested in it and are willing to let us work with them. And so we'll be able to work with the specimens at some point, but it's a matter of really determining, can we do that? An inordinately high number of useful plants, and I don't know if I already skipped past the thing saying useful, medicinal, or edible. And by useful, I mean specifically to people, that we make things out of this, out of whatever the plant is, or some part of the plant. Not just eating it or making a medicine, but making some tools, and that's sort of the one continual hook into archaeology that I have with these. My favorite example of showing that it's not analogous to any current ecotonal distribution of plants. There is no modern equivalent of what Florida in the Pleistocene looked like, are the loblolly and the Caribbean pines, which both have been reintroduced. Some places they're even naturalized, but they are not here native. They were extirpated naturally, and literally loblollies went north, Caribbean pines went south, so they went that way. Genetically, there's some interesting bits going on too, because there's so much time has passed since the 14,000 year old specimens down at Vero as well. But you can see the native distribution of the Caribbean pine down into Central America and across a number of the islands. And loblolly is back, but it's not, it was reintroduced to the landscape. Then the other one that I always love for this example of they went that away is this, the jujube, its nearest relative, is that away, is, I think I'm pointing west, over in Texas. And this is a really strange plant. Unfortunately, there's 2 seeds that were found that were soaked in paraffin and are of limited utility. The really interesting aspect about this, that I've talked about this before a couple of times, but I want to bring up, is that the extinct Pleistocene gummy bear is a joke I've made for a while, and I've only recently discovered that one of their dispersal mechanisms, in fact, requires they get ingested by carnivores. So the cover image of the saber cat fighting the direwolves may in fact be over the jujube territorial dispute. That in fact, every time I keep flipping over a rock and learning more and more about these individual plants, the story gets stranger and stranger. And the dispersal mechanisms is what's really missing in a lot of the plants in Florida that either go extinct, become extirpated, or have greatly reduced ranges. And I've got 5 examples of plants that were at Vero that no longer occur there, but are in the Big Bend. And well, we'll talk more about that as I get to them, but there's a giant hole in the discussion by botanists and plant people of, we don't understand why they're so restricted. Why is there only one plant of the Ziziphus salata that is 20 miles long, and it is genetically one plant? That's not really viable for long-term survival, and probably not a good sign, but other seed dispersers included. It wasn't just carnivores eating jujubes, it was also a lot of the other mega herbivores as well. We'll get into things that are present. This is one that was present at every of the, or 3 of the big sites that I've looked at: Vero, Page Ladson, and Latva Simpson. The cockleburs, I'm sure everyone here has had them stuck to them and they're annoyed. They're said to be exceedingly toxic. If you eat more than, if you eat 0.75% of your body weight, probably lethal for even like piglets, or it'll matter at the scale of a cow or a horse, all the domestic animals. If you're 12,000 pounds, I don't think there is a stand of cocklebur big enough for you to eat that could cause a problem. But the mastodons at Latva Simpson 37,000 years ago and at 14,500 years ago at Page Ladson both ingested quantities of them. Also, as I say, with everyone being hooked by these, you know what a hitchhiker they are. And the mechanism at the end of the Pleistocene to disperse them means deer is the biggest animal on the landscape. There's maybe some bison on the landscape, but that's a very contested thing and hardly assured. It means their dispersers are gone. It's going to be humans and deer for anything that's big enough to catch numbers of them and move them any great distance. Like I mentioned, I'm still at Vero predominantly here, but the pollen or some of these things do show up at Wakulla Springs, where our 13,000-year-old mastodon is, just the bones but not digesta, and then in the oscilla as well, the water shield. Lots of these plants are edible and have medical uses as well. Water cabbage being one of them, does some very interesting things as an antifungal and anti-inflammatory. One that is a really strange situation, similar to what's happening with the one surviving jujube in Florida that's present. I forget where this one was present. This is at Vero. It's disappearing. It is actually extirpated right now from Florida. And the problem is it's genetically constrained. there has not been a female colony or females present in a colony identified in a number of years, and so it looks like the pondberry is on its way out, that it's just not genetically viable. Its long-term prognosis is bad. I want to touch on the dispersal mechanisms here because the surviving Holocene fauna includes a lot of the mammals, and of course the bigger ones. I did not find any information on deer, but birds do not like it. Somebody sat and observed 82 birds that went and landed on the plant, pecked at them, and left, and only the thrush had any interest in them at all. So I think it's a very mammal dependent for its dispersal, and I think the extinction at the end of the Pleistocene really did affect a lot of, it did affect its long-term viability. Oh, I'm sorry, I was looking in the wrong spot. Here, I was looking at the next slide and reading off that. But here's some other pictures of it and a little discussion of who will eat it and who won't. And I shouldn't have left the question mark. It is, in fact, not present in Florida at the current time. Another one that's very interesting for medicinal uses and self-medicating. And I say medicinal and I mean human. When I say self-medicating, I really mean mastodons. And we'll get more and more into that because it turns out, an awful lot of information tucked inside the digest or stomach contents of our animals here. This is kind of my type specimen for something that was formerly present at Vero in Indian River County, where I put my little red X, and now only exists here. Literally from the Steenhatchee to the Oscilla is actually its known distribution for corkwood, which floats and has a number of other uses, but the green area that's highlighted almost mirrors the growing zone 8B. And there are some plants that are in Florida restricted only to their to 8B growing areas, and this seems to be one of them. And again, becoming a much rarer plant that it doesn't really have a good reason for why was it at Vero and it's not anywhere near there now and on a much, much reduced environmental or landscape or distribution footprint. So moving predominantly out of Vero macrobotanical stuff to things that were found over the years at Page Ladson and Latvis Simpson in the Oscilla. So Page Ladson in the upper half of the lower half of half a mile rise there, and Latvis Simpson is almost straight to the left of where the Little River logo is, at the bottom of the Little River section. So the big gaping hole in the distribution and in the explanations for the life cycle of a lot of these plants is that. And I think we can make a pretty good case for that, and certainly a good case for we really ought to look at this more closely and look at the other species that are on the Pleistocene landscape as seed dispersal mechanisms. But it's not just seed dispersal. They're basically a big mobile biome filled. Their gut contents include obviously all the things they need to survive, and that includes a number of different fungi that eat their stomach contents, or more likely when they've left. But their behavior itself for what they're eating and their biological needs and limitations are aspects to consider, as well as the fact that they are a walking mat of cockleburs and other seeds that will hook onto you and take a while to drag around. And when they vanish, I think it's really affected some of those plant species here. And I'll finish with what I think is the best example of an unknown Florida relic Pleistocene fossil. That's something that every one of you has probably got stuck on you today. Don't know that it's vanished from the Pleistocene and only reappeared much more recently. Sorry, why am I? Somehow I went backwards. Sorry. So Latvis Simpson is it's greater than 34. Actually, I'll show the date in the next slide that we calibrated. It's actually between 37 and 38,000 years old. There's a lot of very interesting edible species here. Of course, the squash, and these are the oldest squash in the New World that have ever been dated. There's grape seeds, elderberry. There's also pollen of elderberries down at Vero, but we don't. That's sort of incidental to the talk right now. The creeping cucumber seeds coupled with the elderberry and the cocklebur, are all critical that I think we can tell why this mastodon perished, actually. The cypress seeds are also important, but Matt Milbachler wrote a short article in Current Research in the Pleistocene and mentioned two really critical things that I picked up on mercifully. One is there's a lot of ground up wood pulp of cypress in the digesta, and it suggests they were probably eating it, which is a bad thing for elephants. Also, that a lot of these species, these don't grow on the edge of the water. These are brought in. They're very clearly summit contents. We know that for a number of other reasons that I'll get into in a minute, but suggests introduced species in probably midsummer, and we unfortunately lost one mushroom that showed up under the microscope that got crushed when somebody was trying to recover it. This is actually a picture down at the bottom left of where the sample was taken that included all those species, the overlying peat, and then we have video of me collecting that sample in '95. In the sandy area down below it is where all this chewed up short twigs and everything were. What you're looking at where the blue arrows are vertical are the tusks of this intact animal. She was a young adult, probably about 17 or so, and she was pregnant. We actually found fetal mastodon bones with that animal. The kind of crazy part is that she's pregnant, and we'll get into elephant biology a little bit in a minute, but keep in mind the elderberry, the creeping cucumber, and the cocklebur. And I'll bring those up in greater detail in a moment. This is one of the seeds. I have one of these from Page Ladson that's 14,500 and some great seeds and tendrils that are on display on the artifact ID table downstairs, as well as two bones from that animal, from that mastodon, if you want to see them, that are actually 37,000 years old. And there was a little bit of archaeology there. I've shown this slide in other talks before, but that is a little lipped stone flake of material that's not from Florida that was in that sample that I took in the previous picture. What it's doing there, I don't know, but as we continually push the date back for the occupation of the New World, it's not as crazy as it was when we tried to say we had a 37,000-year-old flake in '95. And I've published on it, and no one's either found it or read it because nobody's complained about it. And since I got to talk about a stone artifact, I'll just mention that normally they get me up here and I am allowed to talk about Clovis points and other fine, fairly benign things. And I'm pretty sure after where we're going now, they're never going to let me speak again, because we're going to go inside the elephants. And unfortunately, we're not coming out. The material at those two sites, there's pollen as well, so there's other things to look at, but the macrobotanical things are not simply background noise on that landscape. They are, in fact, stomach contents. They were actively selected by the elephants. All right, so we're going to get into some elephant biology for a minute, and this won't be pretty. First off, we're incredibly lucky that mastodons, mammoths, are a little more closely related to the Asian elephants, who leave things that look more like what horses would leave. The African elephants leave things that look more like cows, are more heavily digested, and nobody wants to pick through that. And we're not going to get the kind of data because those things are no longer present. So the elephants are self-medicating. That pregnant mastodon at Latmus Simpson has 3 different plants. 8 of the 8 plants we've identified, 3 of them are designed to make, they are laxatives. They are very powerful laxatives. And all right, I'll fess up that I didn't know when our farm got overrun with elderberries that you have to cook them first. So how many people here have ever eaten a quantity of raw elderberries? Thank you, I'm glad I'm not the only one. Now, I'm not an elephant, and I know I'd have to eat a lot more to affect an elephant's biology, but the creeping cucumber, when it goes from the green to the black phase, the seeds in particular are, I have it in another slide, they are, quote unquote, a powerful laxative. So the biology of elephants we need to introduce here. They are commonly afflicted at all ages, and in particularly pregnancy, by bloat, constipation, and diarrhea. Eating cypress pulp is probably not a very good idea. It's one of the things that can cause bloat or constipation. That animal clearly needed to go and was working hard to find plants that would assist. There's examples out of Africa of following elephants that walked, a pregnant elephant walked 2 days to find a relative of borage that will help induce labor. The native people use it for that, and the elephants know to use this borage plant to induce labor. Elephant's gestation is 22 months, and this elephant gave birth 4 days later. It knew what it was doing. It was clearly doing self-medication, and that's the word zoopharmacognosy. And the Europeans and Africans really are leading the way in these studies where they have the large animals and they study particularly elephants, the self-medication of those elephants. And it's, grouped within evolutionary ecology of today. And so none of them have looked at anything other than modern things in any of the literature I've found. So since I'm probably not going to talk about stone points for a little while, I've dubbed myself the first paleozoopharmacognosologist, because I don't think anyone else is worried about it from samples from the Pleistocene, in part, and that's really a testament to how important and how rare the dung samples that we found at Latmus Simpson and Page Ladson truly are, that there's a wealth of information there that we should continue to look at. As young, elephants eat the leavings of their parents to develop their gut biome. And so one of the things that turns up when you're looking at pollen and looking at all the tiny, tiny things under the microscope are a number of fungi that are cycling through the body of elephants. One in particular had a very good article in 2018 written about the first one, Sporomonella, found at Page Ladson. That we also have them at Wakulla, but it turns out that article yada-yada'd over some of the most important things. The next three, Sordaria, I can't say any of these, the next three on the list were also present, but they didn't examine them. And by not doing that, then we don't know, do they change in frequency through time? Do they diminish? Do they go away when the Sporomonella does right at the end of the Younger Dryas? The problem is that she worked on those as well, and at 10,600 years ago, 2,000 years after the Younger Dryas and the extinction of the mega herbivores, we don't think there's mastodons or anything there. 2,000 years later, though, there's a massive spike, 4 times the present. So there's a lot to be done here, and it turns out we do find them everywhere we look. We found 4 species of these fungi, 4 of the 5 that were at Page Ladson. We didn't have the yeast down at the bottom. At Wakulla Springs, just in our layer with the bones of the mastodon. At Vero, we found 2 of the 4 at the top and 5 others that have not been properly or fully identified yet. So it turns out where we have even the remains, not necessarily digesta, the remains of all these animals, there is a lot of the gut content surviving or identifiable in the pollen-sized pieces of everything that's preserved. So again, and I really don't mean to be very critical of our article. What I mean to say is that's a jumping off point. There is a wealth of information that we need to be looking at in addition to that. So I'll come back to what's the contents at Page Ladson for a minute here. 61 different species that Lee Newsom and others identified. One that turned up in the pollen recently is the red mulberry, and there's a lot of it in almost every sample in the pollen that they examined from a couple of cores. But again, you see lots of things here that are edible to us, things that we would think are very nice. A strange aspect of this that's kind of neat is that the grapes and the cucurbita both have rind and seed tendril fragments. It's not just seeds, that we're actually getting even softer tissues, softer plant tissues that are preserved there. So it's really kind of unmatched. It's really unbelievable to find 38,000 and 15,000-year-old things. The really exciting aspect to me that sort of set me off on trying to do this topic in the first place are 2 plants that were found at Page Ladson that are the only native original evidence for those plants in Florida. Viburnum is not naturally here. It's been reintroduced. It's naturalized. It's everywhere now, but it has actually been brought back into by people later. It disappeared at the end of the Ice Age. And the only evidence for Osage orange being in Florida is that 2 seeds were found in the 15 or 14,500-year-old dung at Page Ladson. And dispersal for this, you can look at the size of the orange, the ball seed there. Not a lot of animals going to eat enough of that to be very effective. Here's some trees. The natural distribution no longer includes Florida, of course. The natural distribution is, there's the seeds I was talking about. The natural distribution is actually quite small, and the Galt site in Texas that a number of people have talked about over the years here, massive clovis site, they grow wild all over the site, which is kind of funny. All right, getting to the end here, there's a couple more things. There are a number of plants that should be here that we might expect to see that don't turn up. I just mentioned one here, the downy serviceberry. It's a nice edible plant, and it's probably a little hard to see, but you can see the light area in the Big Bend and a little bit to the east. That's zone 8B again, and its only distribution is in this part of Florida. If it's going to be anywhere in Florida, it should be right here. This is a modern example. I don't know of a prehistoric example of this, but Christmasberry, when we were working out in the salt flats on the coast, at the salt works and some other sites, though that plant is edible and it pops up on archaeological site. It's almost a tell of if you see concentrations of Christmasberry, there's an archaeological site. In peninsular Florida, from about Ocala south, there's another one, the guinea hen weed is ubiquitous on mounds in many areas. If the conditions are right and there's a mound, there will be guinea hen weed, which is also an edible. I've mentioned Pleistocene fossils, things that have survived that don't necessarily survive for any obvious reason. And I think that's because of the lack of the seed dispersers, particularly the mastodon, but also the mammoth and even the gomphothere here in Florida. And of course the self-medicating thing. So within the suite of plants I've talked about, we have prickly pear, the prickly cucumber, pokeweed, cocklebur, and elderberry are extreme laxatives that the elephants were clearly ingesting. Here's an actual living fossil. This beetle was found in the Pleistocene deposits at Vero. It's believed to have been very common in the Pleistocene and then almost vanishes until horses and cows are reintroduced by the Spanish and everyone since then. Now this beetle is all over the place, but it kind of shouldn't be here. It seemed like it was on the verge of extinction until large animals came back. Well, so now I think we're looking at a plant, the Spanish needle wasn't here. There are no references to it in any of the literature prior to about 1830. That it appears to have been restricted to deep South Florida and that it was a very limited range. And I've not found it in the pollen record of anywhere, and I've not found it as a macro-botanical yet, but I think there's ways to get around that, and I'll end with that in just a moment. This is a growth of it next to our garden that has not been disturbed. They branch out, they can get 10 feet long, they have lots of leaves all over the place, and we'll come to their seeds in a moment. But when I mow it, or my cows, which we have Scottish Highlands, we let them out and they browse right down to the ground. The plant changes its adaptive strategy and it goes wide and low and it shoots out tons of little sprouts and tries to cover as much area as it possibly can. And it's clearly an adaptive response to being grazed. It expects to be grazed. There's a lot of argument about what goes into it. Within conventional farmers, I've heard 18 to 19% protein. That's not true. There's about 4% protein, but it is the single most popular plant on my farm. The cows, the goats, the pigs, all of the chickens, ducks, turkeys will eat that over everything else. They prefer that to any other plant or feed that I give them. They will walk past other plants to go find them. Well, so the beggar's tick is a pretty obvious name from the seeds, if you remember, and I'll show them in a moment. The little spikes on the end of them stick to everything. Lots of different species all over the place. One of the things, and I haven't really mentioned this prior, is that the genetic composition, the nearest relatives for a lot of these plants, especially the things that were in Vero, show up now in the area of the Big Bend. Their genetic relatives are all coming out of Mexico and South America. And it doesn't mean they're tropical plants necessarily or semi-tropicals. It just means that the genetic relation is closest to things that are moving back and forth, where we know mammoths, gomphotheres were coming as well. Yeah. Oh man, I got 2 slides and I'm done. Okay, so Biden's produces 6,000 to 8,000 seeds per plant, and obviously everyone here has had them on them. I actually think there's some on my pants right now, that they get everywhere. And the lack of the mastodon seems to be the problem, in my opinion. This is something we can work on and we can figure it out. But their distribution now is everywhere, that we know they're all over the landscape. And why they don't show up in the historic record and we haven't seen them anywhere in the Holocene is a very strange thing, because it is such a successful plant and it thrives everywhere else. I think it's one of those missing Florida fossils that if we can find it, Opalus or Phytolus, and I didn't mention that, but the silica is very high in that plant. It's designed to wear the teeth down of everything eating it, and I think that's one of the future things we should look at, and I better just quit right there.
Thanks, Andy.
Sure. You want to do